I just want to introduce Sean Hansen. I hope all of you were able to watch his TED Talk. And we're here today to speak with him about his experiences, particularly with suicidal ideation. And Sean, I'm just really grateful that you've come and that you are willing to be open with us today and just share with us what's happened for you. And as promised, I thought we'd start with the question, what happened 15 years ago?
Sure. So I was deployed to Iraq as a explosive ordnance disposal technician. And for those who don't know what that is, or who have not seen the Hurt Locker, basically you disarm roadside bombs, or as we call it in the industry, improvised explosive devices, as well as kind of a variety of other missions. But for me, I guess the capstone moment that led to sort of this ongoing saga with PTSD and all the various paraphernalia that comes with that was my team got called out to a place called Route Iron, which was kind of out in the countryside. And basically, things didn't feel right from the beginning, but we didn't really have anything tangible to go off of. And without kind of getting too far into the weeds on like individual procedures, basically, I missed a detail that, and by missing it, I guess I should more accurately say procedurally, I did not do something that I would have normally done. And after, 15, 16 years of overanalyzing this, I still have no idea why. I don't know if it was because I was sleep deprived or what, but basically I missed a detail, and then I watched my friend and teammate get blown apart by an improvised explosive device. So, um, so that element of having missed that detail, but in such a way that it sort of triggered this sense of culpability, I think that for me was something that has hung around for a pretty long time, obviously. And I think that it's something that in the veteran community, at least, there is a pretty significant manifestation of this survivor's guilt that comes whether you feel like you missed something overtly, or whether it falls more in the category of, well, I should have done X, Y, or Z in order to, protect my friend or save my friend. And so the combat deployments that I experienced and the fellow combatants that I've been around, and admittedly, like most of those are in the special operations community, I know plenty of individuals who have had really, really intense combat experiences where a lot of people have been killed, but it's always been the enemy that's been killed. And so they end up, quote unquote, winning. And, you know, when I've observed those friends of mine that have come back from those kinds of deployments, despite the fact that there was a lot of violence being done, to me at least, it seemed like that missing ingredient of culpability, or that missing ingredient of guilt, is what sort of delineated whether one person was getting into a PTSD scenario or not. And so for me, that was sort of the capstone moment that occurred.
Right, right. And so, I mean, for you, you obviously have experienced a lot of guilt about what happened to your teammates. Can you say more about that? Like, what that has felt like for you, and how that's manifested the guilt?
Sure. Yeah. So there's this thing that they used to do called River City, and River City was basically a communications blackout to make sure that when somebody was killed, that the military had its opportunity to notify the survivors of that individual, so their
Mhm.
family, in a way that was formalized and theoretically proper. Like in theory, these individuals that would then notify the family members had had some training, and et cetera, et cetera. So after River City was lifted, which was basically 2 or 3 days later, after my teammate was killed, we ended up calling his widow. And the sounds that she made when we called her, the only thing that I can liken it to is pigs being slaughtered. And to be on the phone with somebody in the middle of the night And hearing those kinds of noises, and then hearing sort of the endless litany of, I need you to come home, I need you to come home, I can't do this on my own, I need you to be here, I need you to be here, and recognizing that you're not going anywhere. Like, we were back on the job, like 10 hours later, and it's denying the survivor of your friend, your friend's widow, and saying, like, no, we're not coming home.
Mm.
Your pain is being superseded by this mission, by this job. um, that's been a big part of it as well. But for me, I think the bigger piece consistently is this not knowing.
Mhm.
Obviously, my teammate was a really experienced operator, and in many ways he actually had more experience than I did. But again, I don't know if he saw what I saw, and I don't know if he put together what I put together. And I've laid out the scenario for other EOD techs, and to help them kind of like sharpshoot this scenario, and to lay blame on me if that's what they thought was necessary. And they've all said, no, you know you couldn't have known, and this and that and the other thing. But the thing that sticks with you is the fact that, sure, I don't know, I know that he died, and I know that his wife will never have him again. And I think when there's such a tremendous cost involved, that these scenarios of, well, here's your way to dip out of this scenario, like here's a way to absolve yourself of responsibility in an environment and a community that is predicated on taking responsibility. And that's, I think, one thing that, and I don't know if it's peculiar to the special operations community, but that community is very much driven by ownership and responsibility. And nobody cares why you didn't get the mission done. The only thing that gets reinforced over and over and over again is that you didn't get the mission done, or you did, right? And if you did, thumbs up. And if you didn't, nobody gives a shit about your excuses. So that's kind of the environment that, and the training ground that we find ourselves in mentally and emotionally. And how is it that you juxtapose, or maybe that's not the right word, but how do you separate yourself from this training that has ingrained in you a certain performance standard, to then be in a place that's not riddled with guilt about the fact that we didn't achieve the mission. And not only that, but one of our friends died. And so I think from that perspective, that's another key component of this, is the feeling that I violated the ethos on which the community is built. And I was not my brother's keeper, so to speak. So that's I mean, there's a lot that gets woven into this, but I don't know if I addressed your question or not.
Oh, absolutely. And what I'm struck by is how, like, it seems like you started searching to understand, like, what happened so that you could take ownership and responsibility for the incident. And it's amazing for me to just hear how much and how many years you've been searching and trying to uncover, like, what happened. um you mentioned his wife, and how hard it was for her to be alone when she heard about him dying. And for me, I wonder about you, because I mean, the two of you were so close, and you work so closely together, and it must have been very hard to just, like, get back on the job when you also suffered such a huge loss at the time. Um,
Yeah, I think there's probably an interesting wrinkle that comes with combat. So we, during that deployment, we lost about a third of our guys, and roughly a quarter of that was KIA, which means killed in action. And then another roughly 8% was serious WIA, wounded in action. And when you think wounded in action, it's not like, oh, I got a cut, I have a boo-boo. It's, no, I'm missing part of my body now, or I'm blind, or I'm paralyzed for life. Because typically the types of weapons that we were working against were things that had tremendous impact. And so, when an explosion happens, the human body tends not to fare so well. so,
Right.
so by the time that my teammate was killed, we'd already lost a lot of people, and there was very much a sense that was pervasive to the team of like, we're going to die here. And I like to think that it wasn't in some sort of melodramatic way, but at least in my instance and what I observed in my teammates, I would think it was just a very matter of fact, concrete assumption that we were making, that whether it was this deployment or the next deployment, like, we're just going to, at some point we're going to die here. And so as far as getting back on the job, I don't know. I mean, the thing that struck me more, I guess, was, so the night that it happened, they gave us the night off, like the higher ups gave us the night off to write the report so that we could disseminate that information to other EOD teams around the theater. And because it was a new technique that had not been utilized to this point in time. And so it was basically information that other people really could benefit from. So we wrote the report, and then we had basically the night off. And I remember at one point, so it was a 3-man team that was now 2 people. And we at one point like got in our cots and turned off the lights, and I remember just laying there for probably, I don't know, a couple hours. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that when you're on those deployments, I mean, you're basically within an arm's reach of your teammates for almost the entire time, for months. So that, I mean, literally you can pretty much almost all the time reach out and touch them. And you get to know people biologically, where you know what they sound like when they're asleep, you know what their movements are in the dark, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so at one point I just like flipped on the lights knowing that my teammate was still awake. And, because like both of us are basically staring at this empty cot that used to have a body in it. And I think we just watched movies the rest of the night to kind of distract ourselves. But, like 4 a.m. the next morning, they're like, hey, you guys have another IED call. And it was just like, okay, here we go. So, because combat doesn't stop, like just because you've had a rough day, nobody gives a shit. And so you're basically like back in the saddle and go get the job done. So from that perspective, it was very much, I don't really believe in compartmentalization because I don't think we actually do it. But I think we partition, or at least, that's the attempted compartmentalization. So it's this partitioning. And that was really what I was focusing on, was just, okay, like how do we get the job done? Because we still, I think, had like another month and a half left on our deployment. So.
And so did you come home a month and a half later? Like,
Yeah, more or less. We actually volunteered to stay longer, which is something that I think a lot of combatants do, is they get to a strange place where being home doesn't feel like it fits. Nobody understands. And so a lot of the combatants that I know, like if they're given the choice, especially if they have troubles at home, for instance, like if things are in their marriage are not going well, or they have stress with their kids, it's this kind of noble sacrifice. Oh, we'll all volunteer to stay longer. And it's a convenient excuse to not go home and face other issues. So we actually volunteered to stay longer, but they were like, no, we got it. Thanks.
well, and I was thinking to go home alone too. I mean, if you're so close with one another, especially when you're sleeping at night and you're working, I mean, to go home would mean to separate again. And from your TED talk, maybe go home to people who may not quite understand what it is that you just have experienced. And so for me, it sounds like it might be like safer to stay with everyone than to actually separate and return home.
And there are plenty of people who don't understand, and you have the individuals that are very enthusiastic about it because they want to, support the troops. And there's almost like an excitement, like, oh God, what was it like? I mean, it must've been so cool. And I was like, okay, yeah. I mean, there are really exciting moments, you know, but then there's also a lot of terrible moments. And in the end, a lot of the exciting moments and terrible moments are woven together. And so then it ends up kind of being this thing that you're just not really particularly excited to, to be all enthusiastic about. And, you know, at least in my case, and I observed this in other people as well, is, you know, the taking of human life, even if it is the enemy, at some point it's not really, and this might sound weird to people who have not been in combat, but there's a beginning crest of this experience where it's exciting. Like, you are doing the thing that you have been trained to do. You're doing the thing that for many of these people, they've wanted to do their entire lives. And also many people believe, I was not really one of them, but many people believe that we're fighting an evil enemy. And I mean, that really wasn't my situation. I just kind of thought we were on opposite sides of a chessboard that was arbitrarily chosen. But, you know, I was going to do my part to protect my brothers, so to speak. But before I get too far off track, you know, there's this idea that it's exciting to go wage war, you know, to execute the thing that you've been trained to do. And then after a while, I think gets to a place where you're just, you know, you're like, okay, we're just taking chess pieces off the board here, you know, and it loses this mystique, you know, as you get more and more involved in it. And then you're just, I think you kind of end up in this place where you're like, well, how many of these people do we have to kill before it makes a difference? And I don't know, maybe I was overly intellectual about the combat experience, but I think that's another reason why people sometimes struggle when they go home, is people want to, I don't know, they end up in two very awkward camps. Either one, they're all about it and they want to hear all the gory details that a lot of times guys don't really either care about or want to share, or they end up in the other end of the extreme where it's like, this is the thing that shall not be named and we'll never talk about it. And then the guy kind of feels like this, you know, and women too. I mean, I shouldn't segregate like that. But again, it's this awkwardness that comes up of either I want to know all the gory, bloody details, or we'll just pretend it never happened. And neither one ends up in a good spot.
And it's so interesting with how suicide is a lot like war in that way. I mean, it is, you know, what we don't talk about. And the reason why you and I are here today with everyone that's joined us is to like talk about what we don't talk about. And that's when someone has suicidal feelings. When did you start having PTSD symptoms? Like,
well, if you ask people around the command, right away.
they noticed.
Yeah. So I was very angry when because basically as an EOD, like IED response guy, so responding to improvised explosive devices, responding to post blasts where, you know, guys have been hit and you have to go and analyze, why did it happen? Why did it happen here? What did they use? Blah, blah, blah. Whenever you're in a response capacity, you were always being set up on. And at least in Iraq, there was no returning fire because the primary weapon of choice was improvised explosive devices. And one of those cranks off, well, you can look around, right? So you've just been hit by an explosion and you can look around and you can see the townspeople and they're just kind of staring at you. They knew it was there. I mean, they almost always know. Of the, oh geez, I don't know. I think I disarmed over 150 improvised explosive devices, and that doesn't include the ones that we didn't disarm that just went off on us. And I think maybe twice, definitely less than 5 times, were the townspeople surprised. But most of the time, they're just kind of standing there like, okay, so what are you going to do? Are you going to start mowing down civilians who you have no proof that they were actually involved? And if you know the full mechanics of what's going on, like if they tell you that it's there, if they tell you that the weapon is there, Al Qaeda or ISIS or whomever is going to show up in the middle of the night, abduct them, and then spend a lot of time probably torturing them to death. So they're not incentivized to say anything, right? So there's this anger that I think builds up because you have nowhere to place your aggression, nowhere to place your violence. It's you're just absorbing it constantly getting hit, ambushed, you know, and you're just kind of like soaking it all in. And so then with the PTSD symptoms, when I came back, I was super intense. I mean, if you think I'm intense now, I'm very mellow now in comparison. But yeah, I was really, really intense about training guys to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and to survive because I watched so many guys go down.
Right.
And so that's something that the teammates noticed at the command. And then I was just really angry, like all the time.
Right.
And so, but the actual suicidal ideation, that didn't come till after I was done deploying.
Yeah. And how soon did the suicidal ideation arrive after you were done deploying? Like
Mm,
months, years, like
probably within, I'd say 4 months, probably, because I finished my last deployment. And this is also something I've noticed with combat deployers is when they get out of the military or when they rotate to a non-deployable status, it typically, at least from what I've seen anecdotally, takes about a month. And then all of a sudden they start having intrusive nightmares and they, have all these kind of symptoms start showing up, the sleep disruptions, the, hypervigilance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once your sleep starts getting disrupted in a major way. So for instance, with me, it was about a month and a half. And in that month and a half, I was sleeping somewhere between 0 to 4 hours a night. And it would be like days on end of me only getting, I don't know, 45 minutes, and oftentimes kind of broken up in like 5 to 10 minute chunks. And I would wake up drenched in sweat, having just had a bunch of really gnarly nightmares. And that, when that starts to progress and you're not sleeping, like you start to feel like you're going insane. And so a lot of things start to go off track at that point. And then, one night you find yourself with your gun to your head and you're like squeezing the trigger.
right.
And, I think for a lot of the guys that have been in that scenario, there is that don't actually kill themselves. There is something that motivates them to not finish squeezing that trigger. And for me, it was my parents. I knew that they had already suffered a lot during my deployments in terms of the fear and anxiety. And so I made a deal with myself to to not kill myself until they were dead.
Mm. Oh. And you still like suffer from suicidal ideation. Is that true? Like,
Yeah. So some years are better than others. I think a lot of it depends on what the cumulative stress load is, and I'm very disciplined about sleep hygiene and all. I do all the right things,
mhm,
but yeah, I think for whatever reason, there are some years where I don't know whether it's things with my partner. If she's really stressed out about something, and where am I taking on that level of stress myself? But and I've done various modes of therapy repeatedly, and including psychedelics, which was something that was really cathartic for me and helped me release a lot of the pain that I'd been holding on to. And um, I do recommend them in sort of the right setting. It's not something that I think you should do unsupervised or with people that are not professionals, but for those individuals that are able to access the right setting that have that kind of proper support, I think that they can be very powerful, provided that person has been kind of teed up or prepared to look really deep inside themselves. But yeah, I mean, just like this last couple months, uh, I've been dealing with it. And, I think part of it is, as you were saying earlier, the things that we don't talk about end up just getting worse. And I think a lot of times, whether it's family or whether it's sometimes even therapists, they they get into this very uh, I don't know. I know that they're trying to be gentle and they're trying to be supportive, but it's kind of like, hey, if we can't laugh about killing ourselves, then like, what are we going to laugh at? So taking it overly seriously, I think also is a detriment because then it's, all this focus gets put on the issue. And then all of a sudden the person's like, fuck, man, I'm really fucked up, and it's like, well, maybe we just need to kind of have a little bit of a laugh about the fact that you want to kill yourself so that it's not always feeling so weighty and momentous. It's just kind of like, it's all right, like it happens. You're going through a rough patch and your sleep is messed up again, and what might we do to kind of bring in a little bit more self-care? Maybe you're not going to work out as much. Maybe you're going to, lock the guns away so that you can't just have easy access. Because even in suicide, humans are lazy creatures. So, I mean, if somebody really wants to get after it, they will. But, I find that a lot of times, especially with the friends that I've spoken to who have had suicidal thoughts, just eliminating easy access is something that helps them get through those crisis moments. So,
Like for you, I know sleep contributes to your suicidal ideation, but what else do you think drives it? Like what's
yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I've been asking myself a lot because I would be more than happy to put this thing down. Um, I think that part of it is this notion that who am I to have survived? And I think one vestige and legacy of that time in Fallujah was, yes, we reached that conclusion that we were probably all going to die there. But I think combining it with the incident that I had, I think it went from an inner narrative of, well, I'm probably going to die here to I should die here. And this idea that so many of us went down, and who am I to have made it through that? Because I certainly wasn't a better operator. It wasn't like all these other guys are just idiots, and if only they were as good as me, then they would have made it too. I mean, they were really good, really professional, competent individuals, and they knew their stuff. And so I think that randomness and chaotic nature of life in general, but combat in particular, because combat has a way of sort of putting you face first with the randomness of life and death. And I think our minds try to make meaning out of everything. And so it's kind of like, well, I wasn't better than these guys. Um, so yeah, so why should I deserve to live? And of course, you can always try to find reasons, but I think that's part of the narrative.
like how have you done with like forgiving yourself for living, forgiving yourself for what happened?
I guess some people would argue not so well, but I think that this between the various rounds of therapy and also the psychedelic experiences down in Mexico, just so everyone knows, I'm not breaking the law here in the United States, but I think that helped a lot,
Huh.
and I believe that we tend to excavate to a level that we're capable of, and then we sort of sit at a plateau for a while before, I don't know, before whatever sort of cogs need to turn in the background to allow one to tap into a deeper level of processing or forgiveness, or whatever the work is for that individual. And I think that perhaps this year is kind of because it's definitely spiked. So it was sort of declining for a while, and this year is definitely a lot worse than it has been for a couple of years. And so I feel like maybe that's a signal to me that I'm ready to dig into a deeper level. But self-forgiveness is a tough one, especially with, I would say, anybody. I think at least it feels like the human condition to take responsibility and to have this kind of me-centered focus of, well, if only I had done this or that. And there are days when I'm more aligned with the sort of philosophical nature of, well, maybe, but you didn't, and it didn't, and this is what you have. And there are days, I would say, I mean, it's thankfully gotten a lot better. This used to be 5 months out of the year, but now it's about 8 weeks, I guess. So, but getting to that place of forgiveness is really, really tough generally, and I think especially in the community that I came from, where forgiveness is not a thing we do.
Right, right. And the same goes for self-compassion too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like success every time is the entry fee.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
that's it. There's no like, oh, grand celebration if you do something really well. It's just like, you did your job. So it's like, it's like table stakes to just always win. So.
Like, I know that some of the guys that you know will be watching this recording, and I wonder, like, what message do you have for someone who is in your shoes, who has survived combat, who has symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, who is suicidal? Like, what what do you what would you like to tell them or share with them about your experiences and how you've stayed alive?
Well, for starters, lock your guns up when you start to feel like things are going off track. I mean, like I said, we tend to be lazy creatures, even in suicide. And so that's just a quick tactic to kind of get you through. But the other piece is being more vocal and reaching out to whatever support network makes sense to you. And I know for a lot of people, their spouse can oftentimes be a source of stress, whether it's direct conflict or whether it's, oh, I don't want to put this on them. So if you don't want to go to your spouse or your partner, then, figure out who you can talk to share the load. And I think a lot of people, they don't want to share the load. It's an aspect of, well, I'll just grit my way through this because I don't want to seem screwed up. I don't want to seem deficient in some way. And so sharing. So first off, lock your guns up. Secondly, share. Find the people that care about you, that care about you. And I don't necessarily you don't need to go on social media and just start, blasting the airwaves, but I think getting that load spread out and also having more than one person to share it with is, I think, important because this can be pretty heavy stuff. And you can really fry somebody out if they're the only person with whom you're sharing this. So, so those are some big steps. And then I think also just recognize, like, even if you have to fake it till you make it, just tell yourself every day that it's not going to be like this every day. It's not some life sentence that will show up every single moment of every single day. And then lastly, I would say, don't take it so seriously. I have in the past and still sometimes struggle with kind of taking my own pain too seriously. And I get really precious about my pain and like, oh, you don't understand my pain and you don't know what I've been through. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe not, but do you want to be on the planet or don't you? And it's, you can make this life a better life if you just choose to.
And Sean, I'm struck by, like, how, you come from uh, the mindset of success in the military, as you were mentioning before, and how you are a success, like you've come home. And yet it's been really hard for you. Like, you attack yourself for that success when you've reached the ultimate success of coming home and being with your family.
Yeah. And that I think raises sort of a bit of a paradox because one, there's the gratitude of making it home. But then secondly, there's the notion that you didn't do anything special to come home. Again, kind of what I was saying earlier. It's not like I was a better operator than the rest of the guys.
Right.
I was just lucky. I mean, I've had moments where because I was standing here and not 1 foot to the left, I lived. And like neither position was a more tactically sound position. So I think that there's that paradox of I'm really glad to be home, but then at the same time I don't feel like I really deserve to be home, and so it creates like a kind of a weird pressure chamber, trying to bounce back and forth between those two sentiments.
So we're going to open up to the audience pretty soon, but I have one more question, and it's, what advice do you give therapists and coaches who are working with someone like yourself? Like, for instance, nonchalance can go a far way, humor,
Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for practitioners, it's something where obviously you want to establish rapport first. And I've noticed, I guess, probably two, maybe three sort of main quirks in my work with therapists. And that is one that I don't know why, but you must be trained for it or something, but therapists tend to use like their library voice. So they're always talking really quiet and really soft. And I remember with one, she was an EMDR therapist. She was actually really, really good. And I got a lot out of the therapy, but we had a bone to pick with her up front because I was just kind of like, what are you doing? And she like was all taken aback and she's like, well, and again, still in this very soft voice, like, well, what do you mean? Like, I can barely hear you. Like, why are you talking like that? And, and then she adopted a more, normal tone of voice. And I was just kind of like, oh, well, I feel like I'm just trying to be non-threatening. I was like, I'm a special operations combat veteran. I could snap you in half. Like, you're not threatening to me. Start talking to me like I'm a full grown man, which I am. And, it was just kind of patronizing to me. At least that's how I took it. So, so I think you can use a regular voice with people. So that would be step number one. And then obviously, just as far as establishing rapport, don't try to. I've had a couple therapists that were, I don't know, like, I think in their attempt to try to empathize and to establish a bond with me, they tried to kind of be in my shoes when they were not combat veterans. And it's like, I don't need you to be more special operations than I am. Like, I need you to be a professional doing what you do, because doing what I did is what fucked me up in the first place. So maybe you can just, you don't need to out trauma me. So, so that would be step number two. And then again, like, as I was saying before, I think levity and just kind of being like, yeah, this sucks. Well, what do we want to do about it? If you've really truly come to the conclusion that you're better off not being alive and your whole social circle is better off not being alive, if somehow magically you manage to like come to that objective right answer, which I would venture to guess you would never do. But if somehow magically you were able to do that, then like, okay, like do what you got to do. But most often it's a matter of like sleep deprivation. It's a matter of maybe some neurochemicals being off, and it's a matter of kind of catastrophizing the moment. And so being able to have a little bit of levity, like, not taking it so seriously, not being so precious about it. So those would be my top three.
Great. Well, I'm now going to open up to the audience and see if there's any questions that people might have.
Sure.
And I'm sure nobody's going to be using their library voice.
Good.
So someone said that they'd be interested to hear from you what impact or differences it would have made if that first night had been handled differently.
Sure. So for those who may not have pieced that together, so basically the incident happened during the day, and then we had that night off to basically write the report, and then we were back on the job. So that's the setting. What the military eventually started implementing, and bear in mind that at the time that I was in Iraq, like, we were very, very short-handed, understaffed. Like, we just did not have enough humans to do the job. So there really wasn't a lot of luxury or leeway in that regard. So with that caveat aside, what the military started to do was to actually, when some of these casualties occurred, they would give the people who were immediately involved a few days off. And having talked to some of the people who went through that experience, I don't know that it did much for them because you don't it's not like you can just magically kind of like depressurize yourself, and they would actually to some degree like bring you away from the combat zone that you were in. So let's say if you were in Fallujah, they would transport you to Baghdad and to one of the really big bases, like that are safe enough that we actually bring like musicians, well-known musicians, to these bases because they're that safe. Like, we're not in the business of killing celebrities. So um, it doesn't do anything though, because you know that in a few days' time you're going to go right back. And so to fall apart then and there doesn't really go anywhere. It only makes you feel exposed. It makes you feel like you're going to weaken the armor. So they have chaplains who try to come in and talk to you, but a lot of the chaplains, I mean, they've never dealt with death before until they do. And I think again they kind of do those three things that I just talked about, not doing. And I don't know that it would have made much of a difference actually, because my mindset is on staying operational. Because the last thing that I want to do is to be separated from my team. To be special. Oh God, well, we got to get you out of this because like you can't handle this. That would have been how I would have interpreted it. So I would have wanted to stay operational. I would have wanted to stay with the pack and to, continue to fight. And so I don't know that it would have made a real tangible difference unless they were just outright to say, hey, you're going home and you're going to go through this intense therapy experience. But even then, that might have made the guilt even worse because now the rest of my team is still over there. And that actually does happen. Guys that get physically hurt and have to be transported away to heal, they will find ways to work. I mean, I know a couple guys that scammed their way back in country, like broke all the rules and magically showed up in country again because they wanted so desperately to be back with their team, to not be the special case. So hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. The next question is like, what therapies have been helpful? I know you've talked about psychedelics being really helpful. What
Mm-hmm.
uh, can you say more about psychedelics, and can you say more about other therapeutic modalities that were useful to you in your
Sure.
healing?
Yeah. So initially I did cognitive processing therapy, and that I did not find was very helpful. I don't know if it was just the practitioner, but being asked what it was like to watch my friends die or to this or that, well, it was pretty shitty. Like that was kind of the answer that I would always have for that individual. So I didn't find that particularly helpful. But I thought EMDR, I've done EMDR more than once, and I thought that EMDR was definitely very helpful. I also thought that somatic experiencing therapy was really helpful. I had no idea what I was getting into. And for anyone that is contemplating doing it, I would also say don't, don't research somatic experiencing therapy too much, because then you might kind of, I don't know, steal the secret sauce out of the experience. But those were both really helpful for me. And I think with the psychedelics, so I've done quite a variety now at this point, between psilocybin, ayahuasca, ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, and they all have their own sort of unique flavor. And one of the things that I think is very, what's the right word? Powerful about those experiences is that they tend to offer up what it is that you really need to look at in order to make progress. And it may not match what your initial conscious intention is. So for those individuals that are going down trying to look at one thing, they might actually end up looking at something completely different. But if you think of it as a chessboard, you sort of have to get the pawns out of the way in order to get to that back row of players. So that has been really, really helpful for me. I think coaching has also been effective in terms of, if I were to put therapy in the sort of camp of, okay, let's look directly at the trauma, and let's look directly at what it is that you told yourself, about others, specifically to that trauma event, and how is it that you can get to maybe a place of forgiveness or compassion. To me, coaching falls in line with, okay, how do you prospectively or proactively want to structure your mindset so that you can recognize at certain times of the year that you may be dragging yourself down into, depression or, again, some sort of PTSD flare up. What is it that you can do prospectively, not just from a lifestyle perspective, but also from a narrative perspective and an inner narrative? What is it that you want to be saying to yourself? How is it that you want to be talking to yourself? Which I know that there's obviously overlap between those two camps as well. But so those have been what I found helpful.
Thanks, Sean. Here's a question in the chat that I find really interesting, and it's whether or not you talked about what happened with your team. Like when you were in the dark and you realized your other teammate was awake and you turned on the light and you could see the empty cot. Like, did the two of you talk about what happened with one another?
So I guess I would see two ways of talking about it. One is tactically, doing the after action report of this is what happened and yada, yada, yada. And then the other would be, how are you feeling? So no, there wasn't a lot of how are you feeling. There was, I think that we both saw how the other person was feeling. But then again, this is not a community that's big on emotional exchange unless it's with your fists. And then, then sure, there's plenty of emotional exchange. But as far as emotions that would convey either joy or vulnerability in some way, like none of those really get brought up. And I would argue that, yeah, it is to our detriment. But I would say that much of the military community has almost no capacity to engage in that with one another. Every now and again, you will get, I think, certain relationships form where guys can be more vulnerable with one another. And it's an interesting juxtaposition because they are very brotherly with one another. So it's like they love each other very deeply and they'll die for one another, but they don't want to talk about it. And so that tends to be kind of this weird thing where it's like we experience it, but we don't discuss it and we don't conceptualize about it and we don't analyze it. It's just like, yep, I got you. Yeah, okay, I got you too. And that's kind of where it stops. And it's like you feel it really palpably, but you don't want to talk about it.
Right.
As far as the tactics go, yeah, I mean, we did talk about it. Because part of what ended up happening on the scene when the incident occurred was that I spent a lot of time talking with my team leader. And by a lot of time, I mean probably 2 or 3 minutes, discussing, hey, I think we're about to be ambushed, instead of just getting on the radio because my teammate was already kind of out in this field. Instead of just getting on the radio and saying, hey, I think we're being set up, everybody come back and let's talk about this. I just was conversing with my team leader instead of broadcasting that message. So we did talk about some of those aspects. And, I mean, again, it was just kind of like, you couldn't have known, you did what you did, drive on.
And on that day, was it your intuition that was telling you that things were off, or were you noticing things were off?
Things had been strange in that area for a while. There were a lot of hoax devices that were just boxes with like a wire sticking out and bricks to make sure the box couldn't blow away. And essentially what was happening was they were just studying our response times and what route would we come in from. And, they were just gathering information. And there was I think it was about 6 weeks of that kind of reconnaissance happening. And it was actually with a sister team of ours. And then it wasn't until we rotated, and I think that was just random chance, but it wasn't until we rotated that we ended up getting the real deal. So, and it was most definitely an ambush because the infantry Marines that had called us to the area, one of their team leaders, basically there were two like real devices. One killed my friend and then the other one I disarmed by hand. And on either side of that device that I disarmed by hand were a pair of US Marine Corps boot prints. And he had basically been standing on top of it for about 10 minutes because they didn't want to kill infantry Marines. They wanted to kill the guys that were, assigned to disarm improvised explosive devices. So, but yeah, so we did a lot of talking about the scenario, but not a lot of emotional talk.
And there's another question, and it's about your parents.
Yeah. Okay.
And are they still alive?
They are hanging on.
Yeah.
They're actually quite healthy.
Yeah. Well, they'll be glad to hear that. Right.
I know, I can't kill myself yet.
So are your parents like still the reason why you don't kill yourself, or have you found other reasons?
So that's part of it still. Um, my wife is another big part of it. And I think also allowing myself to believe that my death would have a tremendous impact on people. And I think that from what I've read, that's not exclusive to the military. I think that's a lot of people who are having suicidal thoughts, especially if it's laden with some sort of survivor guilt, that you are a detriment, or that you, at the very least, nobody would notice or nobody would care, that life would just go on. And I mean, philosophically, yes, life always does go on, right? I mean, that's a fact, that life does somehow continue. But I think a lot of the folks that are suicidal, and myself included, when you're in that phase or you're in that kind of murky headspace, you do end up feeling like, well, it wouldn't really make much of a difference if I was no longer here. So over the years, partly because I've been more vocal about sharing my experience, in turn, I've had more friends and family that are like, this would completely screw me up. I may not kill myself in exchange, but my world would come unglued. And hearing that enough times, it just kind of gets to a place where you're sort of like, all right, yeah, I guess I don't know what they see in me, right? Like that kind of self-deprecating talk, but I'm willing to accept that that would be their position. And now I feel a sense of responsibility not to put them in that place of pain.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for being here with us today and being so open.
Yeah, of course.
Uh, I mean, I know so many people that are in your life that think of you with such high regard, and you know the impact that you've had, particularly with your TED Talk. I remember when it first came out, I would get phone calls and just hear so many guys with tears in their eyes, and you know they were able to cry and just like really release a lot of trauma that they had been holding inside. So you're impacting people like one-on-one as a coach, you know, as a friend, but also with your TED Talk and everything that you're doing to help people. So
Thank you.
I'm really grateful that you're in my life and that you are here with us today. So thank you
Um,
so much, Sean.
yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah.